He began to scream before dawn, and by noon on the first day, the entire castle knew of his cries. There was no plea, no intelligible word in these sounds, only a ragged, throat-tearing howl that turned into a hoarse, almost animalistic growl. Servants passing under the windows of the prince's chambers crossed themselves and hurried on. The guards on the towers tried to look toward the forest, as if it might be safer there. By the evening of the second day, his lips were cracked from screaming, stuck together with dried blood, and on the third day, he began to bark. It was a hollow, hoarse, whining sound, as if his throat could no longer produce human sounds. The doctors insisted on severe mental exhaustion, the monks on the possession of evil spirits, and those close to him whispered that the prince would no longer be able to receive messengers or read letters. When his tongue began to turn black and swell, no one doubted that he was dying, but for some reason, death was slow in coming. Just a month ago, he had been sitting in the reception hall in full armor, holding a cup of wine and listening to the ambassadors from Krakow arguing with the elders of Zhmod about the borders. Then he was thin, but strong. His eyes were shining, and his voice was firm. But the winter was harsh, and after a long campaign in the north, the prince returned to Trakai with a fever. The doctors, as was customary, began with bloodletting. Twice a week, they cut his veins on his forearms with a sharp knife, draining almost a mug of thick, dark blood. After that, the prince became pale and silent, and the wounds healed slowly, festering and giving off an unpleasant odor. He was given a decoction of valerian root and dried juniper berries to drink. Warm stones were placed on his chest, and his temples were rubbed with hazelnut oil. When the first ulcers appeared on the inner thighs, the maids decided that they were caused by rubbing against the chainmail, but soon the ulcers began to fester and become covered with a yellow crust. At this time, turmoil was already brewing in the palace. His nephew, who had been raised in Poland, was secretly meeting with Catholic bishops, offering them concessions in exchange for support in the event of the prince's death. The old nobility, who remembered pagan rituals and military campaigns, saw him as a traitor. Only 2 trusted guards were now on duty in the prince's chambers. The doors were bolted, and only his personal physician and confessor were allowed to enter. All other information about his condition was conveyed in short notes, sealed with wax. With each passing day, the illness took its toll on him. His face was swollen, his eyes sunken into red bags, and his mouth smelled of rot. According to his personal scribe, the prince spoke to himself more and more often, sometimes in an incomprehensible language, and once in the middle of the night, he jumped out of bed and, staggering, began to crawl across the floor, rummaging through the skins as if looking for something. When they tried to lift him up, he whimpered and sank his teeth into a guard's arm. The guard was left with a deep wound on his wrist and was urgently sent to a village under the supervision of a healer. The palace records show that in the 6th week of his illness, the prince stopped swallowing solid food. The doctors cooked him thick porridge made of millet and honey, but he spat it out, leaving sticky traces on the pillows. His tongue swelled, its edges turned black, and deep cracks appeared on its surface. The chronicle scroll of the senior scribe, Stanislav, states, "His speech became muffled, like the roar of a beast in a trap. The meaning of his words slipped away, and soon he began to utter sounds unbecoming of a prince." It was at that moment that his barking was heard in the hall for the first time. The servants, unable to bear the nighttime sounds, asked to be moved to other rooms. The confessor demanded that the prince be allowed to see the monastery's exorcists, but his nephew categorically refused, fearing rumors of demonic possession in the ruling family. Meanwhile, Polish messengers were already bringing letters with questions about the ruler's health, and in neighboring principalities, people began to openly discuss who would be the first to march on Lithuania if the power weakened. In his chambers, permeated with the smell of old medicines, pus, and rancid candle fat, the prince now lay almost motionless. Describing his condition, the physician wrote, "His body has weakened, his hands and feet are cold, his sores ooze a foul-smelling liquid, his breathing is labored, his heart beats rarely." The people were already saying that the prince had been punished by God for not seeing the war with the Crusaders through to the end, while the old warriors whispered that he had been ruined by the oaths he had taken in his youth before pagan idols. By the end of the third week of his cries, he could only moan, and less frequently. But at night, in the semi-darkness, when the candles went out, a quiet, barely audible barking could be heard coming from his chambers. The guards on duty prayed without looking toward the door, while his courtiers discussed more and more urgently what to do if the prince died without a will. The following lines were preserved in correspondence between his wife and brother. "His mind is clouded, his body stinks, and his soul may already have left him. Lord, do not let us live to see the day when dogs mourn the prince instead of people." The second week, after the prince finally lost the ability to speak, was a turning point, not only for his health, but also for the fate of the entire principality. His body had already begun to emit an odor that could not be masked by incense or decoctions of pine needles and dried flowers. The servants complained of nausea, and the guards, who took turns at the door, often spat into the ditches to get rid of the taste of rot in their mouths. The doctors tried to slow down the decomposition of the living body with remedies known since the time of the former grand princes. Warm compresses with honey and ash, rubbing bear fat into the skin, bathing in decoctions of wormwood and elecampane. All this provided only temporary relief, after which the ulcers began to ooze again, and the skin around them took on a greenish-grey hue. Stains resembling burn marks appeared on his thighs and stomach, but the flesh in these areas was soft and caved in under his fingers. In letters to the Polish bishop, intercepted by messengers from Gmod, the prince's nephew already called himself temporary guardian of the throne. He assured that the great ruler is in a state of infirmity, deprived of speech and reason, and therefore the affairs of state must be entrusted to healthy hands. In response, a secret blessing arrived from Krakow, and 2 advisors were sent to the palace, ostensibly to assist in diplomatic affairs, but in fact to watch the prince's every move. Meanwhile, the illness progressed. The prince hardly ever got up, only occasionally attempting to sit down, but his body trembled like that of an old man. He was now fed a liquid porridge, which was poured into his mouth with a wooden ladle. His tongue was almost black, flaking at the edges, and with each swallow he made a short, painful sound like the sigh of a dog caught in a noose. Sometimes, in fits of convulsions, he raised his head and tried to bark, but only a hoarse rasp came out. The confessor, fearing for the ruler's soul, insisted on daily prayers at his bedside. In his notes, he wrote, "His spirit may already be in purgatory, but his body is still in this world. The devil sends him visions, for at night he stares into the darkness and whispers things that are not fitting for the ears of a Christian. These words reached the ears of the prince's nephew, who demanded that the priest remain silent, threatening him with exile. Rumors began to circulate in the capital that the prince was being turned into a dog as punishment for secret murders and breaking his oath before the altar. In the markets, women traders told each other that they had seen court dogs running to the palace gates 3 nights in a row, howling and scratching at the doors. Servants secretly claimed that even when lying unconscious, the prince sometimes jerked his legs as if he were running. The report of the palace physician, for the middle of the month, states, "The body temperature exceeds the normal by 3 degrees, the pulse is weak, breathing is accompanied by wheezing, like a drowned man pulled out of a swamp. The eyes are cloudy, the pupils are dilated, speech is completely lost." The physician tried to resort to opium, dissolved in warm beer, to relieve the pain, but the prince spat out the mixture, and the remains of the liquid left a whitish film on his lips. Realizing that the ruler's days were numbered, his nephew began to transfer loyal people to key posts. He replaced half of the guards, dismissed the senior scribe and appointed his own man, and restricted the access of ambassadors to the reception hall. In case of sudden death, he had already prepared a public statement claiming that the prince had transferred power to him by mutual consent and in his right mind. Tension was mounting in the palace itself. Old boyars, still loyal to the prince, tried to break through to him to hear his last words, but the doors remained closed. One of the guards, who disobeyed orders and peeked into the chambers, later recounted in a tavern, "He lay there like a carcass, black saliva dripping from his mouth. Flies crawled on his chest. I swear he looked at me and blinked, but not like a man, like a beast." By the morning of the 21st day of his illness, the smell in the chambers had become unbearable. Servants changed the straw mattresses under the sheets 3 times a day and kept the windows open even in the cold of night. Puddles of pus poured from the basins used to wash the sores froze on the windowsills. The doctors no longer spoke of recovery, only of how to slow the decay. The prince opened his eyes less and less. When he did, his gaze was empty, and only occasionally, as if from the depths of forgotten instincts, did he begin to growl softly. This sound made even the hardened guards tremble. The people began to say that until the prince died, the city would suffer with him. And indeed, a wave of fever swept through the villages and suburbs. The weak, the elderly, and children died from a strange fever, which doctors explained as bad air. All this was happening against a backdrop of prolonged political turmoil. Mercenary troops were already gathering on the western border. Messengers from the Swedish king had arrived in the north with an offer of an alliance against Lithuania, and within the country, disputes were raging over who had the legitimate right to the throne. But the key to this power still lay in the hands of the dying prince, whose body already smelled of the grave, but whose heart stubbornly continued to beat. By the 4th week of his illness, the prince could no longer be called a human being in the usual sense. His body was decomposing while he was still alive, and everyone who entered his chambers could see it as clearly as a scavenger sees a corpse on the road. The last color had drained from his face. His skin had turned waxy and stretched over his cheekbones, and deep brown spots had appeared on his neck and chin. These spots sometimes oozed sticky pus, mixing with sweat that ran down his neck to the collar of his shirt. Under the underwear, which was now changed twice a day, new pockets of ulcers were found, circles with a purulent rim, surrounded by swollen and painfully red skin. Losing patience, the doctors tried the most brutal methods they knew. They cauterized the affected areas with red-hot iron, rubbed the flesh with a mixture of crushed garlic and salt, and poured a strong decoction of wormwood and yarrow into his mouth to drive the rot out of his insides. These procedures were accompanied by the patient's wheezing and muffled cries. After cauterization, thick dark blood with black clots oozed from the wounds, and the smell rising from these places was so pungent that the young assistants to the doctors lost consciousness. Meanwhile, the conspiracy, previously hidden behind the doors of councils and secret correspondence, began to operate openly. The nephew, now the de facto ruler of the palace, led several hundred guards out of the city, replacing them with his own men, ostensibly to guard the roads. The old boyars were forbidden to meet without permission. Envoys from neighboring principalities and order-lands waited weeks for an audience, and when they were finally received, they spoke not with the prince, but with his temporary administrator. Servants whispered that the confessor was visiting the sick prince less and less often. They said that during his last meeting, the prince, not recognizing the priest, raised his hand with mutilated nails and ran them across the priest's face, scratching his cheek until it bled. Immediately after that, guards rushed into the room and dragged the ruler back to his bed, and the door was locked. The priest later claimed that he saw in the prince's eyes a yellow glow not characteristic of the human gaze. By this time, his tongue had rotted away almost completely. The front part had turned grey-black, the edges were eaten away by ulcers, and a sweetish, putrid odor emanated from his mouth when he breathed. Food was now fed through a reed tube, but even this caused vomiting. When he tried to utter a sound, only a hoarse, drawn-out grate emerged, vaguely resembling a bark. In the evenings, when the torches were extinguished in the castle, only one guard remained at his door. And this man heard sounds coming from inside, as if someone were crawling on all fours and scratching the stone floor with their claws. Once, he swore that he heard the prince barking, and that the barking was answered from outside, from the courtyard, where the dogs roamed. Meanwhile, panic was growing in the city. Rumors that the ruler was cursed and turning into a beast led to crowds gathering at the palace gates. Women, holding their children, prayed loudly for his death, believing that only then would misfortune leave the country. Merchants complained about the decline in trade. People were afraid to enter the capital, fearing the rotten spirit and contagious diseases. The city clerk's record preserved the following words: "The smell coming from the windows of the prince's upper chamber can be smelled in the street. Horses at the gates begin to stamp their hooves and snort, and dogs howl as if on the night before a funeral." The nephew, urged on by his allies, was already preparing the act of transfer of power. All he had to do was wait for the prince to breathe his last breath, to present the will written by a bribed scribe. But the dying man stubbornly refused to die. His heart, despite everything, continued to beat, slowly and unevenly, but enough to delay the political denouement. The doctors, in desperation, suggested an extreme measure: to wash the prince's body in water infused with henbane and St. John's wort, and then smear the entire body with a mixture of beeswax and camphor oil to seal the decay. The procedure lasted almost the entire day. When he was pulled out of the tub, the water was cloudy, grey-brown, with bits of skin floating in it. After rubbing, the prince's skin shone, but it felt soft to the touch, like an overripe fruit. That night, according to the guards, a loud howl was heard in the chambers, followed by the sound of a heavy body falling and a long, hoarse cough. When the servants rushed in, the prince was lying on the floor, thick, dark liquid flowing from his mouth. He looked at everyone with wide-open eyes, but there was no human expression in them anymore. They lifted him up and put him back in bed, but from that night on, he no longer recognized anyone around him. His nephew understood that it was time to prepare for the final act. But he did not yet know that at that moment, a conspiracy was brewing among the nobility, whose goal was to prevent him from inheriting the throne. By the fourth stage of his illness, the prince had become a sight that even his most loyal followers avoided. The skin on his hands and feet was peeling off in patches, exposing moist, reddish tissue that glistened in the dim candlelight. The smell became so thick and heavy that even with the windows wide open, it was impossible to enter the room without feeling nauseous. The doctors no longer treated him. They cared for his decaying body, trying to slow down the process of decomposition as much as possible. His toes had turned completely black and hard, as if charred. They were bandaged with strips of linen soaked in vinegar. Dark streaks appeared under the skin on his chest. In these places, according to the doctor, the blood is rotting in the vessels. On the inside of his hands, the sores became deep, their edges covered with dry crusts, and pus with a greenish tinge oozed from the center. Tension at court reached a breaking point. A conspiracy by the old nobility, who had learned of the fake will, drawn up by the prince's nephew, was already in place. Several loyal boyars planned to sneak into the prince's chambers and force him, if he was still capable, to sign a document that would transfer power to the Council of Elders until a veche could be convened. But it was almost impossible to get into the room. The doors were guarded by the prince's nephew's armed men, and his personal scribe was always inside. Rumors of a curse spread throughout the city, causing hysteria. People said that every night the prince howled, accompanied by an invisible dog, standing at the head of his bed. Market women whispered that they had seen eyes in the castle windows, whose gleam was not human, but animal. Women carrying water said that a rainbow-colored film had appeared in the wells near the palace, like rotten fat. The confessor, who finally managed to gain access, described the prince as follows. He was lying on his side, and his body was writhing like a bag of worms. His tongue had almost disappeared, dark mucus was flowing from his mouth, and his eyes stared unblinkingly at an empty corner. I knelt down and began to pray, but he made a sound like a short bark and jerked his hand sharply toward me. The doctors, realizing that the end was near, began to prepare embalming mixtures in advance. Barrels of strong wine, salt, and herbs were already standing in the storerooms, but according to the whispers of the servants, they did not believe that they would be able to preserve the body. It was too damaged from the inside. One of the young medical assistants wrote, "If I hadn't seen him breathing, I would have sworn he had been dead for several days." An open confrontation began inside the castle. In the evening, when the nephew was about to announce the prince's imminent death to the council, 3 boyars appeared and demanded to be let in to see the ruler. They claimed to be carrying a letter transferring power to the council for the duration of the prince's illness. The nephew refused, and that same night, A fight broke out in the castle corridors between his men and the guards, who were still loyal to the old nobility. Several people were killed, and at dawn, armed troops from both sides gathered at the gates. The prince lay in his bed, immersed in his own rotten world. The convulsions became constant. His legs and arms twitched like those of a dying animal. A hoarse moan or a quiet growl escaped from his chest. His face was swollen, his lips cracked and covered with a crust of dried blood, making his mouth appear perpetually open. In the diary of the scribe who served at the door, there is an entry. His body was wasting away before our eyes, but his eyes burned with a yellow light. At night, he suddenly rose, leaning on his elbow, and began to stare at the wall, growling as if he saw someone there. I ran away without waiting for the end. By this point, even the prince's allies began to fear that if he died in this state, the people would take it as a sign of God's wrath and turn away from any new authority. And then thoughts began to circulate about helping death come sooner. But to decide to do so meant taking on a terrible sin. And no one dared to do so yet. Yet in the last 2 days of his life, the prince's chambers became a place where only those who did not care what they saw were allowed to enter. His body no longer resembled that of the former ruler. His stomach was swollen. His skin had darkened and glistened as if smeared with grease. Rotten moisture accumulated in the folds of his neck and armpits, exuding a pungent, sweetish odor. His face was almost unrecognizable. His eyes were sunken, his eyelids swollen, his nose pointed, and his lips gray. His tongue, completely disintegrated, had turned into a dark, uneven lump, so that he could no longer even growl, only emit a wheezing sound like wet wood crackling in a stove. At dawn on the last day, an open conflict broke out at the court. The nephew gathered his council and announced that the prince was on his deathbed, deprived of his mind, and therefore power must pass to him immediately. The old boyars, led by 3 influential families, burst into the hall and presented their own document, supposedly the true will of the ruler. The negotiations turned into shouting, the clanging of weapons on the floor, and threats. At that moment, a confessor made his way into the prince's chambers, accompanied by a physician. They claimed that it was necessary to read a final prayer over him and cleanse his soul before his journey into eternity. The physician examined him and said quietly, "He is no longer with us. His heart is barely beating." The confessor began to read the prayer, but suddenly the prince opened his eyes. His gaze was cloudy and yellow, but full of some kind of inner malice. He raised his hand, which had no strength left, and jerked as if trying to push someone away. Then his chest arched. A dark liquid spurted from his mouth, and he made a sound that was taken in the corridor as his last bark. His heart stopped. The doctor checked his breathing and crossed himself, but said nothing. He knew that in the next room, the decision was being made as to who would take power. The confessor, his voice trembling, said, "Lord, have mercy on his soul," and left, leaving the body surrounded by candles. The smell in the chambers grew so strong that an hour later the body had to be placed in a wooden coffin, its insides poured with wine and sprinkled with salt. When they tried to turn the corpse over to wash it, the skin on its back split open, and a murky liquid, mixed with flakes of rotting flesh, spilled out. This was the final confirmation of the doctor's words. Embalming him would be almost impossible. News of his death spread throughout the city by noon. A crowd gathered at the palace gates, and the air was filled not with grief, but with relief. Women crossed themselves and whispered, "Now the trouble will go away," while men discussed who would be the first to take control of the grain warehouses. Dogs living on the outskirts howled until evening, and many said that they were seeing off their new brother. Inside the palace, a struggle for power began. The nephew, supported by his armed men, proclaimed himself Grand Prince. The old boyars refused to recognize him, declaring that the people should elect a ruler at a vesh. Several detachments had already set out from neighboring lands, hoping to take advantage of the turmoil. The chronicle of the city scribe reads, "The death of the prince brought not peace, but turmoil. He was buried in the morning, and by evening the first blood was shed for his throne." Thus ended the life of the last great prince, whose cries and barking were remembered for a long time by the walls of the palace. His death did not bring an end to misfortune, but only opened the gates to new wars and strife. For some, he remained a symbol of God's curse. For others, the last ruler who kept the country from falling apart. But for all, he was a man who left not as a ruler, but as a beast.